Can't think of a better topic and a better group to pull together, wrap up, look beyond what we've been doing over these days. So our closing panel is Extreme in the Mainstream, Information Disorder, Disengagement, and Digital Revolution. So many people to thank, starting with all of you who've sat through these days and participated so actively in the discussions, all the terrific panelists, everybody at UTexas, all the sponsors. Special shout out to two individuals, Sally Dixon and Michelle Daniel, for their terrific organizational work. Michelle's here. Sally's out looking for potato chips because I asked her for a bag, I think, or something like that. So I'm going to throw it right over to Jess Dawson to kick this panel off and get things started. Jess?
I realize that we are the last thing standing between you and the rest of your day, and it's always interesting to be the final panel, so we're going to endeavor to be a little bit provocative and thought-provoking as we send you off on your way. So first, panelists, I would like each of you to introduce yourselves if you haven't already, and what is one thing that you have not heard that you wish you would have heard at the conference over the course of a couple of days? In chair order.
Great question. Yeah, hi, I'm Phil Brennan. I'm one of the co-founders of a startup called Cinder. We build trust and safety software. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of the term trust and safety. Okay, cool. Before that, I worked in investigations at Facebook. Raise your hand if you've ever read one of the reports that Facebook releases about an information operation it disrupted. Has anyone ever read one of those reports? Okay. It's my old team. I hired those people. Before that, I worked at the CIA for 10 years and may or may not have contributed to disinformation.
It's you.
My name is Bret Schafer. I'm a senior fellow at the Alliance for Securing Democracy, which is part of the German Marshall Fund. So we're a think tank in DC looking at the threats to democracy posed by authoritarian governments. So I handle our information manipulation team, but we look more broadly at things like money laundering, cybersecurity, election security. And the idea was to kind of bring together that expertise under one roof so that we're not as siloed as the people who set it up perceived it to be in government. So my work primarily looks at state-backed threats, largely Russia, a fair amount of China, a little bit of Iran. So I'm a little bit of a odd fit for like an extremism panel, although the Russians are pretty extreme just by default. But I guess the one thing that hasn't been discussed, I'm sure it was discussed at some level, but that I would like to kind of dig into is how we make a better argument about the necessity of the work that we do as a community to people who are not sort of steeped in this work daily, and how we sort of diffuse the argument that is coming from the attack side, that there is just the idea that one side of this is, hey, I'm anti-censorship, I may not like these things, but this should be the global internet, should be the town square where people have sort of free expression. And the other side of it, which is this group, is part of the censorship industrial complex. And I think we've done a bad job at fighting back against that narrative.
Hi, I am Tristan Lee. I'm a data scientist and developer at Bellingcat. Bellingcat's an open source research collective where we use publicly available sources of information, analyze and combine them in interesting ways to extract valuable insights. If you've heard of Bellingcat, it's probably because of our work in Russia, for example, investigating the downing of MH17 in 2014, our work exposing some Russian military intelligence operations, for example, the attempted assassination of Alexei Navalny, the assassinations in London. And so my work does not actually focus on anything involving Russia. I mostly work on investigating and exposing far-right organizations and networks, mostly in America and Europe. Before this, my background's not actually in journalism or anything like this. It's computational physics, but in my previous job in Austin, when I was working there, I got there's a spate of neo-Nazi mass shootings in 2019, and that made me very angry, and I wanted to find ways of using my programming and data skills to make it more difficult for these kinds of people to organize and recruit. So I started doing a lot of anonymous work, investigating the far right, and eventually I got good enough to work at Bellingcat. So it's been interesting. And yeah, one thing I want to talk about that I feel like hasn't been discussed much is the topic of this conference, extreme in the mainstream. The increasing mainstreaming of extremist talking points, especially from white nationalist and neo-Nazi communities, into the broader kind of conservative ecosystem. Like back in 2018, the term great replacement was quite fringe. Like you only saw it in like very, like extreme, like siloed like Nazi forums and like on the chans. And and now you see it everywhere. Like Tucker Carlson's talking about it, Elon Musk's tweeting about it. It's a broad conservative talking point, and that's really concerning. And I think that when you combine that with the, I guess, increasing disorder in terms of Elon Musk's running of Twitter and like using that for fairly overt white nationalist purposes, quite frankly. I mean, just recently there was a prominent Nazi cartoonist who was de-anonymized, and anyone posting the identity of this cartoonist or an article describing it is being banned off Twitter. So that's, I'd say, a very extreme change to the information environment that is going to be interesting to navigate, to say the least.
Asking everybody to introduce themselves, and what is one thing that you wish you would have heard more of at the conference?
So thank you. I'm delighted to be here. I'm sorry, I was coming from teaching on the other side of campus. So my name is Jeremi Suri. I'm a professor of history and public affairs here at UT, and I write a lot about the history of democracy and how democracies deal with challenges within and without. And so disinformation and extremism are historical problems, but they're problems of historical proportions that have transformed in this era, as they do in every era, with changes in technology, changes in the nature of actors themselves. And for me, what is always most interesting to talk about, and which I think there could always be more of, would be really how historical experiences can help us better grapple with what we deal with today. And I think our world is new and old at the same time, and history is the laboratory through which we can better understand what we deal with today. So, for example, I think the ways in which lies and rumors are used to empower and disempower different points of view, and the ways in which extremism can generate hate to distract from other issues, to displace attention. These are old phenomena. That is not to say that the history tells us what to do today, but I think more of a discussion of that historical laboratory, that historical experience can be very helpful. And that's, of course, what I try to do myself. One other point I'd make also is I think that this is a phenomenon that is not just global in the way we talk about it as global and local, but I think there's actually an intersection between the local and the global that we've only just begun to understand. And I think that relationship is something I've been trying to think through quite a lot.
So I think that's actually a really, really interesting point that ties everybody's points together. So when you think about the local and the global, and then the trust and the safety, right, and then the mainstreaming of extremism, and then how do we find these nuances? Where do you think concrete actions come from, right? Because a lot of times, we were talking before the panel started about, we need a whole of government approach. Well, okay, then that's like who gets the rose pinned on them, right? So for each of your areas of expertise, what are some things that you would like to see for concrete approaches at which level of governance or policy, I think? So let's try to be really specific about things that we would like to think about, and anybody can pick up and run with that. Or we can stare awkwardly at each other.
I'll start. Maybe we can just go the other order. So 3 things come to mind. I have a list of 100, but 3 things come to mind. First, I think the federal government certainly has a role in setting certain rules and standards for social media and other forms of public communication. That's different from saying that the federal government has a role to play in taking control of these entities. I don't believe that at all. I believe in the private free enterprise system, but I do think it's absolutely crucial that the federal government sets certain rules, for example, for data privacy, certain rules for intentional disinformation to dissuade people from voting, for example. And I think we can do this without in any way jeopardizing the First Amendment, which I think is a cornerstone of our democracy. I think we need to have more of a discussion about that. I don't think we're going to figure out what those rules are, what those guidelines are here, but I think that has to happen. Then I think there has to be cooperation at the international level. And some of that already exists in intelligence agencies and others sharing, but I think we need to have the beginnings of a set of international standards as well. And then I think at the local level, we have to do a better job at the local level of funding and training people to do this within local law enforcement, within the local media. The defunding of local media has led to a defunding of expertise at the local level. And so I'm a big proponent of putting money, public money, philanthropic money into local media. And in doing that, I think you're also funding informed individuals who have the capabilities to address these sorts of issues at that level. So that's where I would start.
Yeah, to dig down into what I was going to say is data privacy laws. I mean, I work for Bellingcat, so Bellingcat is based in Netherlands, so we are subject to GDPR. That can make things quite frustrating when we're trying to, make data sets accessible, but I think the positives far outweigh the negatives. Like, right now, if you live in the United States, I could probably Google your name plus a city you've lived in, and within a couple minutes, I'd probably be able to find your current address. It's honestly horrifying that these companies, that there's just this vast underground market of selling and buying everyone's data in bulk. And I think it leads to, it makes scams more effective and dangerous. It decreases public trust, and it just generally increases our susceptibility to targeted attacks and exposure. And so I think, some kind of American version of a GDPR would be very helpful and in mitigating a lot of these harms.
I would have said data privacy, but others have covered that and probably know it better than I do, so I'm going to skip past that. I think the other thing is there's got to be better data access for researchers, which is being scaled back significantly. Obviously, the Twitter API was more or less pulled from researchers last year. So for the tool that I run, which is called the Hamilton 2.0 dashboard, that sort of collects data from Russian, Chinese, and Iranian state media accounts and government officials from across social media platforms, also from websites. But, Twitter X was our main data source. I mean, that's where Chinese diplomats are. And that just sort of went away overnight. I mean, it's a national security problem. I mean, sort of frighteningly, parts of government were using our dashboard as their source. I think, frankly, they should be able to find an alternative tool. But with X kind of going away as a data source for researchers, CrowdTangle has sent out an announcement to all of us that they're killing that in August. The replacement is not great. Google has never been good about sharing data. And then it's also often put us in an awkward position as researchers to do research on these platforms. You essentially have to enter into an agreement, in some cases a financial agreement, with these companies. So you are somewhat dependent on them. And I understand from the company's standpoint, they can't just be blasting out data sets to whomever because there's obvious ways that could be abused. But we need to come to a way that there's sort of clearinghouses set up where me as a researcher can go to kind of an independent third party who acts as the sort of data broker from the companies, and I can make my research claim to them as opposed to, hey, TikTok, I want to look at Chinese influence on your platform. The answer is going to be thanks, no thanks. And that's a real problem for the research community. And then finally, I think I really, really dislike throwing out the term media or digital literacy because, again, I don't think it actually means anything. But I think we need to do a better job of educating people on how the internet works. Just the fundamental structural things. I mean, let's pare it down to search. How does search work when you enter a query? And, we see this being weaponized, talking about sort of the more extremist elements. Podcasters, for example, will say, you know what, don't trust me. Do your own research. Go on Google. Google this term. People Google it. Surprise, surprise. They get led to the same well of content the podcaster is sort of drawing the conspiracy from, because nobody else is published on this fringe thing. And people just fundamentally don't understand that, because I think they know there's no wizard behind the curtain at Google who's saying like, yeah, I'm a librarian and I'm pulling this book from the stacks. But like the understanding around things of data voids and how the language of a search query can affect the results, I think there's just really, really low public understanding of those things.
I'm gonna make this work. I work in technology. Yeah, so a long time ago, I helped get the 2012-2013 National Defense Authorization Act through the Pentagon, and then through the various committees in the United States government. The NDAA does two things. It authorizes and it approves. I encourage everyone to actually go and check it out. Authorization and approval are different things. Some of them allow, you are legally allowed to do something, and you have money to do something. And so when I enter these kinds of conversations where it's like, what should the government do? And I always skip over that, and I go directly to the National Defense Authorization Act. And I encourage people in this room, you live in DC, find out what's actually being put in the NDAA on this specific topic. And then who will actually be authorized to take any action against it? That is to say, is this like cybercom, right? Is this an NSA problem? Is it about the fundamental hardware of how the internet is piped into the United States? Which, by the way, it flows up under the Atlantic and lands on the beaches of Virginia. Massive data center. Is that a NSA problem, right? Should it be? The Defense Department has a giant schools program. There are K through 12 schools all over the world run by the Defense Department. Should the NDAA say you now have a mandate to do digital literacy? I mean, I don't know. I'm making this up, right? But there are ways that you can say, cool, we're going to put our money where our goals are, and the NDAA is one of those. I loved your point about voting. I'll switch gears here a little bit and talk about the Voting Rights Act. So there are statutes in the U.S. Title Code that say, hey, look, this has been an act of Congress. It exists, right? So if you want to go back and find some regulatory principle, those exist. I mean, this is not a, and I think that was used from time to time at Facebook, where a regulator of one kind or another would approach Facebook and be like, hey, this content violates this existing statute, and you have to take it down. And that was interesting because if it had some kind of grounding, it was harder for Facebook to sort of shrug and be like, well, that's not really our problem, bye. So when, again, in these conversations, it's like, cool, there are laws on the books. And in some cases, it's like, we don't have to reinvent something new. You can go back and find an existing statute and then pull it forward into the 21st century. Some of that stuff's from the 60s, right? So when they might have had the internet, it was pretty new. So I guess instead the thing I'll say is that for everybody here who's a student or still, thinking about what kind of career they want, I would say go work in tech. Like just go do the job. All these companies, all these major platforms have teams. Sometimes it's a small number of people. They have teams who are responsible for allowing that ad. Allowing, hey, are we going to allow all these users to use our platform out of Iran? We're okay with that, right? Like the growth team, those are choices that these companies make. And those choices are made by humans. And you could be those humans. I think that's also an important thing. Sometimes I go to these and I sort of like, well, the platforms. And I'm like, no. The platforms are just people. And you could go be one of those people, or you're very popular among some of these teams. Sorry, man. But those, the team at Twitter that worked on this stuff that got gutted. There's a large teams at Google. There are large teams at Facebook. TikTok actually has a bunch of people who work on this, not specifically Chinese disinformation. And I think those folks are often operating in some anonymity. They often operate in the space that my startup works in, trust and safety. I think those people are always hungry for advice. They want to have some idea from experts here. What should they be doing? What is a net good thing that they can do? They have to balance that against their VP who says, cool, we just need to make revenue. We need to make shareholder value. But I think understanding who those people are and how they make their choices is a big opportunity, basically.
I think those are all fantastic points. And I wanted to pull the thread a little bit more on the privacy piece. Why was Europe so far ahead of the United States with the privacy legislation? And what do you think the second and third order effects of that are or have been? Anyone?
Well, one answer is I'm not in technology. That's why I don't. My teenagers point out that I'm not in technology. So there's no First Amendment. And so one of the cornerstones of our system has been a presumption against any kind of regulation to protect, regulation that would infringe upon the free flow of information. And so it's been very hard. It's not that it wasn't proposed in the U.S. in the way it was proposed in Europe. It's just very hard structurally in the U.S. to do that.
Yeah, just to sort of jump on that point. I mean, there's two Greek terms that I don't remember off the top of my head and would mispronounce, but it's sort of the different philosophies around free speech in the U.S. versus Europe. Where U.S. free speech is, in Europe, free speech is about the ability to participate in speech. And so the idea that as a minority woman, you would go on a platform and be essentially harassed into a corner where you log off is just inherently seen as something you fight against, where it's not in the U.S., of course, because yes, people would think that's bad. There's some people who think that should be shut down, but there is the argument that, like, you know, people are allowed to criticize others on the internet, even in sort of unsavory terms. So I think that sort of philosophical divide in having many of these conversations in the U.S. and Europe, you just started from very different places in terms of what is the problem you're trying to address and what are you trying not to come in conflict with.
I mean, I think that's a really, really good scenario, and it ties back to what Tristan was saying about, you know, the extremism argument. Where do we draw the line from, like, if we were to think through, like, policy-wise, where do we draw the line between critiques and moving into the harassment? There's been multiple reporters and journalists throughout the conference. One of the big themes that has come up is the harassment, either you know, the mean online comments, which is one aspect of it, which, you know, okay, fine, but then there's the showing up at your house, there's pictures of your children, there's the deepfake porn, there's the death threats. Where do we draw the line between critique and harassment? Or not? We can move on to a different question.
No, I think we have to. I mean, it's very hard though, right? I mean, and that is one of the reasons why we have a judicial system, right? I mean, we should have a system in place that weighs the concerns we have about the free flow of information with the also legitimate concerns we have about people's safety and their ability, just to build on the prior point, their ability to continue to function and participate in a process of discourse. And so we already have in place limitations on, for example, I cannot say things that actually directly threaten you or say things that intentionally defame you, unless you're a public official. There's a little more space to do that toward a public official. And so building on that, we need to create another set of building blocks that allow us to recognize when, for example, someone is using the revealing of children's photos or whatever, not to make a point, but to actually harm you, to intimidate. And I think the way the jurisprudence talks about this in the U.S., it's going from speech to action. People should be free to express opinions, but that's not a freedom to act in ways that harm other people with the intention of harming them.
So then the question becomes, is posting online speech or action, right?
Certainly showing up at your home is an action.
Right.
Though, right?
I was actually just going to make a useless comment about that old New Yorker cartoon of the two dogs. One dog's typing on a laptop, turns the other dog on the internet. No one knows you're a dog, right? If it's anonymous, their cost is incredibly low. What's the consequence? Virtually zero. So it really is incumbent on the platform to say, do you require authenticity? Do you have an authentic user policy? And even if you do, it's still incredibly hard to enforce. But if you can harass somebody off the platform and you are anonymous, then the consequences are virtually nil.
I think that ties really nicely into what Tristan, you work on with Bellingcat. Can you say more about the breadcrumbs that enable you to find the anonymous without the specific use cases? Because we don't want to go into additional doxing, but for I know exactly what you're talking about. But what are the ways that that anonymity is both easy and then difficult, I think, is sort of how I'd like you to build on that.
Yeah, so basically, it's very common for people to reuse the same usernames and passwords across websites. Everyone does it. I've done it. I'm sure you all have done it. Just because it's hard to remember, 500 different passwords. So, for example, a fairly common a fairly common workflow. I'll have the email address or a username of a particular, militant neo-Nazi that I'm trying to investigate. I'll look for other websites that they've used that username or email address. I'll look in breach data. For example, if you've signed up for Twitter before 2017, your data is probably included in at least one major Twitter breach where it has your email address, your username, maybe your IP address. So there are a lot of breadcrumbs that everyone leaves around when they're using the internet, and with enough time and experience, someone like me or a dark version of me could figure out a lot of things about you. And it's really concerning. I mean, being able to, having that kind of experience in these digital footprint investigations makes me very wary of any breadcrumbs that I leave online. Even beyond, like for example, you post a picture, of, something of a, I don't know, oh my God, look at this beautiful tree outside my house. Okay, well, if someone's looking at your social media now, depending on the background. On what's in the background, they might be able to figure out your actual house. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Rainbow, the GeoGuessr guy, but it's that kind of thing. There are people who are very good at looking at pictures or videos and figuring out exactly where and sometimes when that photo or video was taken. These are all, all of these kind of techniques are available for anyone to learn, sometimes through resources from places like Bellingcat or DFR. So it's really, you have to be very careful. So, but let me end with a few kind of proactive things that you can actually do. So one is to use a password manager. You want to have a unique password for every website or service that you use. You can basically auto-generate them, and you only need to remember one long, complicated master password that accesses that. I would recommend Bitwarden. It works quite well. I have no relationship with them, but they're open source. They're well audited. They work on a lot of different platforms. And also, in terms of your own personal data, like I was talking about with the data brokers, you can go through these kind of data brokers. Like if you search your name, you can find oh hey, Tristan Lee lives at X address. You can go to that website. There's usually a process for requesting that your data get removed, but there are a lot of data broker websites, and the process can be very long. So there are some kind of data broker removal services. One that I use personally is JoinDeleteMe, joindeleteme.com. You basically give them more information than you might be comfortable with, your name, previous addresses, and they go through and get your data deleted off all these data broker websites, and it works quite well. So I can recommend that. But yeah, beyond that, just be careful about what you post. And at least for me, I tend to assume that anything I write on the internet can and will come back to me later in ways that I might not want. So I try to be very careful of that. And also, even if you have been, I don't know, irresponsible or kind of sloppy with your digital footprint, it's not too late. You can change your passwords on old accounts. You can delete old services that you don't use. There is hope.
A fun note to keep building on. So I think to build on that, though, with looking at the again, thinking about there's been reporting over the holidays that members of Congress across the aisle were swatted. And so thinking about the reporting and the platform that Hamilton, what you all have built, but also where does trust and safety come into this? So when you talk about, you've got to start up building trust and safety, not to turn this into a talking point for your company, but what does that mean, and how do people use that? And is that only for companies, or is there a way for this to become a thing that individuals can do?
Yeah, that's to answer your second question first, no, we don't build that. That's really what Tristan said. I think it's really incumbent on the individual. There are some other companies out there that will help with, they're usually quite expensive, but available to somebody if you're a celebrity and you want something scoured across the internet and then removed. There are some kind of reverse lookup services that will do a lot of that. And then you can put in requests to these platforms and say, hey, I sometimes if it's IP, right, like you have some kind of protection on it. But a lot of the times if you write in and say, I just don't like it, good luck. Facebook doesn't have a customer service department, and that's well known. So I think within what we build is a web app. It's a suite of tools that would allow a team at a platform of a variety of different sizes to take actions commonly known as content moderation or data labeling. So is this image inappropriate for my platform? Some classifier surfaced it to me, a user reported it. Is it bad? Is it not bad? What does that mean? What action do I take on it? From there, you might start saying, wait a minute, 10% of all of the pieces of content that I didn't like came from one user. Who is that? Like, what's going on with this one user account? Tristan Lee at protonmail.com. So now I want to go find out more about this user. What information do I have about this user within my platform's records? Oh, it's they last logged in from Austin, Texas. Here's the IP. Maybe if I'm Instagram, I'm incredibly snoopy and I know their grid coordinates, or I know the information of the cell phone tower. How many people know what a cell phone tower looks like? Okay, it is that kind of crowd. Great. So those big white panels that you see, right? Those are fan. You can see a fan out, and you can almost triangulate and begin saying, like, oh, this person's actually in the Bass lecture hall. So Instagram will do that if you let it. That kind of information, if you want to really understand who these actors are, you can use our platform to be like, now I want to find all this information that my platform collects already, and I want to understand who is this user who's so dangerous, who's creating so much of this content. That more looks like an investigative tool. So if you've Palantir before, that's probably where that comes from. So we put all that together on one platform, and the idea is there are a lot of departments within some of these tech companies whose apps are on your phone right now. Some of our customers are very small. Some of them you're using today. But it's on our website. So OpenAI, big customer of ours, Discord, things of that nature. There, though, those teams are trying to figure out how to handle this deluge of responsibility that their leadership has given them. Like, hey, we want to moderate this stuff. We don't allow child sexual abuse material. Well, how are you actually going to operationalize that? Which is a little bit my somewhat cranky comment earlier was that, no, they're humans who are responsible for making determinations of, are we going to allow this Chinese disinformation network to exist? So the first part is finding it. The next part is like, how do you remove it? What are the actions you're going to take? How are you going to write a script that goes back and deletes that user at every possible server level? Like, how do you ban the IP, things of that nature? So our software saves a bunch of time there. Not to be too salesy about it, but right now that's a very manual process.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to add in, like, the role of trust and safety is obviously essential. I think sometimes we put too much of the responsibility on trust and safety to create a deterrent for the kind of bad behavior that bad behavior is the wrong word, criminal behavior that you see. And also kind of touching on your earlier point that sometimes there's this, almost it feels like there's a need to kind of create an entirely new regulation because it's the internet, but oftentimes like the underlying behavior has been regulated for a long time. And so, part of the problem for years, and I'm going to be a little ageist here, but you bring people into an octogenarian senator and start talking about algorithms, and it's like, I don't even want to touch this because I'm going to look like an idiot. I don't know what I'm talking about. But then you get to what the actual problem is, demystify it, and it's like, okay, yeah, you apply this law that's been there forever. There's the case of, I think the company was called Devumi, which was in both Florida and New York. And basically it ran like comments as a service, and it sort of boosted brands and sort of D-level celebrities by creating a bunch of fake accounts and having them post across websites. And they were prosecuted under consumer fraud because they were defrauding people who are seeing all of these positive reviews for like Revlon. And it's, a pretty straightforward case then. You don't have to get into like the mechanics of how you set up a fake account. So I just think sometimes like we have to think of solutions that go beyond relying on trust and safety, deplatform and downrank, because there's a problem. Like the worst you guys can do, I'm saying when you're sitting at Facebook, is kick the account off the platform. Like it sucks if you spend some time building up a persona, but you just create a new one. And, you lost a little bit of time, but there's no penalty there. And so we have to figure out ways to go after the truly malicious behavior beyond saying, you're in Twitter jail for a few weeks, which I know doesn't really happen anymore, but you're booted off Facebook.
Start to wrap up. We are the final panel for the conference. What are some of the big themes that you have taken away from this conference that you want others to that you want to kind of reinforce?
Well, I joined Facebook in 2017, and I sat on a team called Threat Intel. This is covered pretty well in a few books. There's the two journalists from the New York Times whose names are escaping me, wrote a great one, mostly looking at Sheryl Sandberg. In any event, I sat at the team, and the guy sitting next to me sometime in summer of 2017 finally forensically determined where the Internet Research Agency had paid for advertisements on the Facebook platform in rubles. Finally had actually found the data table that confirmed that, and he just sort of spent the month of July of 2017 just sitting there swearing in his laptop under his breath. And that, I think, going from how... That wasn't that long ago. I mean, it's ancient history, but it wasn't that long ago. Going from where that moment was, where the vocabulary for that kind of tactic existed mostly in the intelligence community, as far as I knew. I mean, the Title 50 of the U.S. Title Code allows the president to authorize covert action against, and some of that can be tale as old as time, disinformation, right? You're going to sow fake leaflets into your enemy's battlefield, et cetera. That's ancient history. But it wasn't part of tech at all. And so really, honestly, for me, to see this conference and the level of thought that goes into the questions and the speakers and the different, right here, right, we've got people who are actually doing the work, who are thinking about the work. I don't know, that to me that alone is so cool, seeing how far it came from at least in my experience, where it was very, very simplistic in industry in 2017.
I'm going to go back to kind of what I mentioned at the start, but hitting on those sort of broader themes of making the case to people that this kind of work has to exist to have a functional internet. And so to sort of turn around the arguments coming at us, which get to trust, and they get to sort of the attacks on the research community and the drawbacks. But when we get the incoming that say essentially, these are elites from Washington, and who's Mark Zuckerberg to say what is and is not acceptable, and we want the government out of this. It's like, okay, that's a winning argument. Peter Pomerantsev and I were talking about this. It's such a simple argument that the other side is making when they say everything more or less should go unless it's illegal. You might not like it. This is how speech works. More speech can combat it. And say, well, functionally, what does your version of the internet look like? I think you made the point, Jess, in the opening panel, the sort of mommy spaces, and I use that all the time. Like, I have little kids, I've Googled at 3 a.m. Is this a real problem, this rash? And if the first 5 results you're getting in that search are places trying to sell you just, some like witch doctor kind of powder, some are maybe more malicious than that, selling you things that would actually harm your child, that's a fundamental problem. And somebody at some level has to be making choices about what is prioritized. So forget for a second censorship and kicking things off platforms. There's like a billion posts a minute. When you go onto a platform, something has to show up at top. So somebody is making that call. It has to happen. This isn't like, there aren't sort of binary choices of the internet where that's one version that's censorship, and here's our version, which is the town square, where this isn't the Lincoln Douglas debates. You're not seeing 2 competing messages. Content gets prioritized. How should that work? That should be a debate, but that's not even the debate, because I think we're getting undercut by this idea that any of this work exists in the censorship world. And I think we need to turn that around and say, okay, like, what's your version of the internet? How does that work? And when you start kind of taking that apart, it leads, and I'm not talking about the people who are acting in bad faith, but the people who are convinced by that argument, you lead them right back to basically where we are now, which is imperfect and messy, and bad decisions are sometimes made, and there's a range of how aggressive you want to be, but there's a human making a choice about what content we're seeing. And then you can kind of have a more reasonable, rational debate, and the Ninas of the world, I've gotten way, way, way less sort of harshly than Nina, but like we're not spending most of our time kind of like fend off weird lawsuits and kind of crazy incoming hate mail.
Unfortunately.
Yeah, kind of building on the importance of a functioning internet to our modern society. Something that is really concerning to me is, I think, the combination of generative AI and the end of low interest rates. I see a strong probability that the internet as we know it will be essentially in-shitified, perhaps permanently in the next few years. I mean, you see several, you see Google, Bing, other search engines moving towards a more AI-based search strategy. There's, at this point, everyone's noticed that Google search has gotten noticeably worse in the last few years, but it's not just Google search. It's pretty much every search engine, and it's not, and as you were saying, like, data access to data is getting a lot harder on these platforms. Like, I don't know if you guys have been using the trick where you just add Reddit to the end of Google search to get higher quality results. That's probably not going to work for much longer because Reddit is, having their IPO soon, and they'll be beholden to the same kind of driving forces that are degrading the quality of all these other platforms. And that's not even to mention the age of the deluge of generative AI content that is flooding these platforms, that is flooding every platform, every search engine, and it's becoming way harder to filter that out. I was listening to this 404 Media podcast where they were discussing the tools that some TikTok creators were using. You basically give these tools, like a subreddit, a voice to use, a music to play in the background, and a video, and it just cranks out like dozens of these low-quality videos that they then push to TikTok, Instagram, what have you. So I don't think any of these platforms are really fully prepared to deal with this just sludge, this like wave of content that is potentially going to engulf everything. So I am not to put too much of a downer on things, but I think it's really important to think about the value that we get out of a functioning internet and the ways that it could be degraded that would really significantly impact our ability to communicate and take advantage of it.
Well, I have a kind of provincial insight from the university point of view, which is that there's so much more research we need to be doing. We have a lot of work to do, and particularly those of us who, and there are many of us who write and think about democracy. This is not a side issue. This is a central issue. It's as central as voting, as central as inequality. And in fact, it touches all of those issues. So, I applaud Michelle and all the organizers for getting us here. And I think this has to be the beginning of a longer conversation and much more research, and research that will involve our graduate students and other young talent, because those who are closest to this are going to be the best new scholars of exactly what we're talking about.
I'll get it to work here a second. So I think all of you have raised some really, really fantastic points. One of the things I think that is a really important thing is we've got to have resources on this, right? We think about the enshittification of the internet. So that's a term that Cory Doctorow coined about, a product starts and it starts out okay, and then there are choices that are made by the industry or the company to slowly but surely make the product worse and worse and worse until it becomes basically unusable. And I think, everything that each of you are talking about is leading us in that direction. But I also think that, as people were trying to find alternative homes as Twitter was kind of going under, as it were, even though it's not gone, but, alternative servers rose up, right? So there's Blue Sky now, there's Mastodon. And I find the content there is very, very different than what's on Twitter, than what's on these other platforms. that's really interesting. I think there's a lot of work that we need to do to understand that, but then also what are the consequences for our democracy if people are all in these different fire hoses that give them different views of reality? I think one of the other things that I've kind of I haven't heard a lot at this conference is this idea about paywalls, right? There's a saying that was going around the time of Cambridge Analytica scandal. You know, the lies are free, the truth is paywalled, right? Academic research is paywalled. You know, the mainstream publications are paywalled, and obviously they have to make they have to fund themselves somehow, right? But as we think about the places that have resources, like UT and like the larger academics, universities, and the folks that have a lot of resources to put at this, how do we shore up, the access to resources? Because you can't just click on something and read it. Now you have to click on something. Now you have to log in. Then you have to decide if you're going to be a subscriber, right? And that's slowing down the spread of validated information, I'll say. So I want to leave a few minutes for questions from the audience. So do we have any folks that want to? Okay, so do we have the mics walking around?
It's okay. I can shout. I can't shout as loud as Professor Suri, but I can shout. Steven Siegel. So Professor Siegel. I'm ready to shout.
You can shout pretty loud, Steve.
Okay, so I'm going to put on my public intellectual hat here, and I'm really intrigued by the takeaways from this conference from those who are practitioners and not just ivory tower people like me. So the paywall thing, I think, is an exceptionally important point. And I get asked this all the time because I work in Eastern Europe with East European scholars, intellectuals, digital content creators, and they just can't get our information because it's so expensive and the institutional fees are prohibitive. So that's point one. The second point, which was really raised here, is something that I would like to ask the panelists about, and that is, if you're migrating from platforms that are public facing, so let's say Twitter, now X, without the API, that's the loss of a very valuable thing. I have a war archive that I maintain. The loss of that was pretty catastrophic because now I have to do things manually. If you're migrating to, say, Blue Sky or Mastodon or going into something else that seems public facing, but is actually just the creation of another sort of like 3 to 5 year echo chamber, how do you know that this is something that will last? And this is sort of like the predictability thing that we had a whole futurist panel with Greg Lindsay and others who I thought were excellent. Call out to Greg, who's here on his laptop. So I just wanted you to give us a kind of like Nostradamus prediction. If you could look into 2030 or 2035, after like Trump is in power for 25 years, if you could look into those sort of forbidding moments and give us like a prediction of what we might be able to invest in, because that's part of the question here, like what actually we're paying for and then what we're making available in the technosphere for students who are Gen Z and after. Thanks very much.
I think that's a really fantastic commentary and question. I think I would. I think the thing that you point out is the erosion of the internet, right? There's been lots of reporting, or maybe I'm just seeing it because the algorithm is pushing it to me, about the decaying links, right? So there's legal cases where the links to the reference are gone now, and those don't exist. And your Twitter archive is gone, and now it's gone, right? I think as we look back, again, to be a little bit ageist, right? We look back over the last 25 years, right? There used to be a thing called books that were paper. There used to be things called vinyl that were albums and CDs, right? And digital is great and digital is wonderful, but there's been a sense, I think, amongst Gen Xers and older that this is sort of ephemeral, and we want to make sure that we still have the physical capabilities. So I would argue that we have to think more about archiving and making the archives somehow permanent. And I think that to use a quote from training day, right? It's not what you know, it's what you can prove, right? And then to add on an armyism, and what you can prove is what's on paper, right? So documents matter, and I think that is both a bias of being in a literate society that has access to that, but also it's a really fundamental thing that we have learned over the last several hundred years. So I would argue that we need to really focus on making the archives, getting them available, and then figuring out how we're going to sustain them.
Yeah, so on the point of archiving, I want to give a shout out to one of the few great things about the internet that legitimately gives me hope, Wayback Machine and the Internet Archive. It's an incredible resource of, I don't even know how many, terabytes are in there, but there's a lot of documents, books, entire libraries, all the, digitized film archives, and the Wayback Machine itself is snapshots of web pages, essentially since the beginning of the internet, nearly. With respect to link rot, a fairly fixed. It's quite linear. I think it's about 8% of links go dead every year or so. So after 10 years, there's a decent chance that around only 20% of links will still be in existence. And the only way to pass link rot is, and that's not necessarily nefarious. People don't renew their domains. Websites change their URL structure. So just archive everything and give more funding to the Internet Archive.
While we're waiting for the other question, I do want to pull on that paywall thread into your point about the issue in Central Eastern Europe about them not having access to quality information. Who fills that void? The Russians, because they give it away for free. They have no issue with RT being plagiarized. That's why RT always shows up in these aggregators and faux local news sites, because they're thrilled. It's amplification. You've got Rupley that gives sort of low-cost video footage to outlets. So if you're talking about something tangible USG can be doing, look at dissemination and distribution and ways of making it more affordable for outlets globally to have access to information created independently, so that those in Africa or Latin America or Central Europe who do not have the money to send a stringer to Ukraine to cover the war aren't getting their information from Chinese state media and Russian state media who give it for free.
Yeah, I'll just build on that, and you know this, Steve. I mean, the U.S. government during during the Cold War made a major investment in actually through radio, through print. Right, Radio Free Europe is one example. Radio Svoboda, which was basically Radio Liberty in Russia, and we could do more of that. We've decreased our information budget considerably in the last 30, 40 years. I think even just bringing that back to Cold War levels, it wouldn't eliminate the problem, but it could help enormously.
Just to throw out a stat, so RT en Español does exceptionally well in Latin America. It is on Facebook the most followed global Spanish language page. In terms of interactions, it's right in between CNN and Español and BBC Mundo. U.S. government spends around $10 million a year on Voz de America, which is, loose change for USG. It's our, those are our neighbors. Why are we not even competing there?
What you're looking for is the National Defense Authorization Act. It literally funds these things. If you want it to exist, it needs to be authorized and approved in the NDAA every year. I actually recommend Telegram. I bet Tristan would too. Telegram will be around in a decade. I don't know about these other ones. But it's not going to go away.
Hi, I'm Bayless Wagner. I'm a reporter for the Austin American-Statesman. I've been listening with a lot of interest about what you guys have said about the media, but also about making things local, and how I'm particularly interested to know how you think that some of the issues you've spoken about, cybersecurity vulnerabilities, disinformation, lack of regulations, will affect the election this year, and what you think we can do to help that, what the government can do, what we can do as people, what the media can do. Thank you.
So I'm going to touch on that very gently and gingerly. And I will point you to, so 404 Media just did a post on the shrimp Jesus, this AI-generated Jesus image that's going around that's Jesus made up of shrimp. And if we look at, we laugh, we chuckle, and it is kind of absurd.
It's not a kosher Jesus.
I don't think so. No, I don't think it is. But if you think about right now, some of the tactics, and this was in the 404 Media article, was if you like and respect the U.S. Army, right, like this page. Well, when you like something on one of these platforms, you've now trained the algorithm to send you more from that page. And so if we think about this not as some harmless, why is this going, but as table setting for being able to reach audiences in a crisis down the road, that makes this a little bit more interesting to pay attention to, and it's not just insanity, I think.
I think that, I'll say the obvious, we're going to be bombarded with all kinds of disinformation, some of it coming from one particular candidate who's running at a certain level, some of it coming from his supporters, some of it coming from many, many other sources. I think what is most important is that institutions like yours, the Austin American-Statesman, set out on a day-to-day basis to provide basic factual knowledge in a place that's easy to get and build a brand around that. You know, when I talk to my students, for example, they're actually pretty conscious of where information comes from. They can get tricked, but they're conscious of what a good source is and what a bad source is. And I think the challenge is not that the Austin Statesman and other local newspapers are printing bad things, it's that they're not printing or publishing enough. You don't have the funding that you need to do the kinds of coverage. But insofar as you can allocate resources and time to providing people, for example, I'll be very, very concrete about this, right? Rather than recreating the talking points that are coming from the two Senate candidates, from Senator Cruz and Representative Colin Allred, right? Actually doing factual reporting on their record and getting that out there for people to read. People are interested in that. And if you establish a brand as being the place for the next 6 to 9 months that's doing that on a consistent basis, you're not going to draw billions of eyes, but you're going to draw enough eyes that it will actually, I think, have some effect on the way people think about the election.
Yeah, one thing that I want to bring up is that a lot of local, kind of smaller and local outlets, when they're reporting on extremism-related events, are not aware of best practices in the industry. So a common thing that you see is a local news story. Oh my God, this neo-Nazi group, here's their website, put up all these flyers, here's pictures of them, it's really bad. And these groups love that kind of reporting. Like the way I think about it, if you've written a story on a neo-fascist group and that group is sharing your story, sharing that story in their Telegram channels approvingly, you've done something wrong. Like, they should not want that. And that's something we think about in Bellingcat, like in our recent story about identifying a Texas active club leader, which was a partnership with the Texas Observer. Shout out to Stephen Monticelli, fantastic journalist. We made sure that we put enough in there that that the leader would be embarrassed to share this article with anyone. And I think that in general, like one report I want to reference, it's the oxygen of amplification. I think local journalists should read that and understand best practices and just be aware of how reporting, especially on extremism-related events, can be weaponized and turned against you.
I think particularly in the age of generative AI, but before that, there are technical skills you need now to occasionally report on an image, a piece of content, to determine authenticity that most local news sources are just not going to have the budget for those kind of experts. Like the New York Times has it with some of your former colleagues there. So we have to do better at pooling resources, I think, among local news outlets. I think there's something sort of along these lines in Alabama or Mississippi, but slightly different. But saying, okay, Austin American-Statesman, you can't hire a former Bellingcat investigator who just is doing digital forensic research, but you sort of cobbled that together with the Houston Chronicle and put 6 or 7, you're still local, you're worried about local issues, there's something that's popping up, in your towns, in your region, so you're gonna have that focus, but you are able to share the expertise that's really needed in the digital environment. So there's a little bit of resource sharing going on, but still sort of a local lens to what's happening.
There's just one other point I wanted to make that I forgot that I should have made, which is that I think it's absolutely crucial that it's not just the most attention-grabbing election stories that you cover, that in fact you cover some of the local non-sexy stories. My wife's on the city council here in Austin, and what frustrates her to no end is how little coverage serious issues get. There is so much ignorance around well-informed people in Austin about local governance because it's just not covered, right? And there's bad behavior that's happening every single day. There, the problem is not disinformation, it's ignorance and lack of coverage. And so covering those stories, covering them, getting them out there, I think can have an enormous impact.
Hello. Just to dwell on the media topic a bit further, my name's Wells Dunbar. I'm part of KUT, the NPR station here. I work for a news program called Texas Standard. Friend of the show, Jeremi Suri, right there.
I recognized your voice.
And so, keeping on with this discussion about media, I'm struck by what are ways that existing institutions like ours, which really seem well suited for this moment, we're broadcast, there's no paywall. What are some, and just kind of spitballing or blue skying here, like what are some directions that existing media could take to help with these issues? Like I was struck a few moments ago by, Tristan's comment about how, Reddit is probably going to be in-shitified with once they have their IPO. So are there other ways we could reimagine local or regional media to become more of a repository and maybe almost more of a platform like we think about like Reddit or formerly Twitter or any of the other sort of platforms we see? Is there a space for local media outlets to sort of step up and become that trusted source of information?
Yeah, I only recommend NPR. Full stop. Like it's on all the time at our house, including y'all. So thanks.
I don't want to get into the sort of platitudes here to avoid, but it's so obvious that the major issue here is you have to make money, and the digital environment has made it almost impossible for smaller outlets to make money, and we're not going to go back. Because the ways newspapers used to make money is you had classifieds, it's eBay, you had auto ads, Auto Trader. So all of the ways that newspapers used to make money that actually sort of required people to have a subscription to a newspaper, if they didn't care that much about the news, you needed to find movie times and things, like that's gone. So we need to sort of level set of that model is not coming back. So what's next? I am not well versed enough into like what specifically we need to be doing to make sure that journalists can have their work funded and cover these issues at a local level. But I think the starting point is we're sort of in this fantasy land of, there's just like a little tweaks here and there and like we'll get back to local news being solvent. Like, no. Like we need a radical change about how we think that local news is going to exist in the future.
That you're hitting on, and everyone is hitting on. These are big structural issues. These are not small things. These are not things that we're going to nudge. We're not going to be able to one magic thing. I do think though that as we're moving forward in this, right, it is incumbent on us to figure out what are the things that we can do. What are the things that you can control, right? There's a lot of things that we can't. But what can you do? If you have the means, subscribe to your local media, right? Make sure that you have, local media, make sure you have gift links that can be shared, and try to be that source that your family and friends can come to find out about information. One thing that my colleague Aaron Pike Dr. Pike mentioned yesterday was, if it seems too good to be true, it probably is, right? We really, really need to be reiterating that. Scams right now are going through the roof, and it's only going to get worse as we think about where we are now in, I think it's March, right? Between now and the election, those scams are going to have an impact because we're going to have people that have recently been screwed over for some reason. They haven't been able to get, things fixed, and that distrust is going to continue to bleed into broader systems. But then I think the other piece too is that we can all be scammed, right? Like, so talking about like when this time you almost fell for something, right? Or this time you did fall for something, it lowers the threshold and it lowers the shame of getting scammed. There's a famous sociology article, Goffman, Cooling the Mark, about people that, get scammed. They never want to admit it, right? Well, we have to lower the shame there. So we have to basically, help each other recognize like, yeah, they got me, man. Crap, right? Shoot, right? And that makes it easier for others to go, crap, they got me too, right? And then you're acknowledging and you're trying to correct the record. So I think we are.
Can I make a couple of comments? Just, Wells had asked for some suggestions, and I mean we could talk about it separately. But Wells, I think when I talk to my students, I have the advantage of having 300 undergraduates, right? So I hear what they're doing. I have my own kids who are in college now, and I think they get drawn in to stories. Most of us up here listen to NPR, listen to Texas Standard because we like getting the news. They want to hear stories. And I think doing more story reporting, I think there's space for more of that. And so, for instance, the piece that you guys recently put up on the growth machine in Austin, that really got a lot of it. A lot of people were listening to that for different kinds of reasons. So the sort of Netflix version of news in the public radio space, right, which is a series, 3-4 episodes that go into a story. Why is it so expensive to live in Austin? Was this, right? My grad students were listening to that. I was trying to get people we were recruiting not to listen to that. So that's one example. I also think, Wells, and I know why you don't do this, but I think being more experimental as an organization. I mean, I find this as someone who writes a lot. I don't know what's going to hit. Right? So much of it is the moment. So much of it is something you fall into. Being more experimental. I think our public radio institutions are still sometimes a little too stodgy. Right, and I think trying to throw things out there, finding a way to do that. And then the third and final point I'd make is, and this you already do well, but I think really thinking more broadly about what talent is that's available, and showcasing more kinds of talent. There's a whole arts community in Austin that I think doesn't get the attention it should get on the radio. I mean, the music does, but I'm thinking poetry, literature. I always think about how many writers there are in Austin. Almost every writer I know who I meet at a conference in New York actually lives in Austin, right? And how little that gets showcased. You have one huge advantage, right, Wells? You don't have to worry about profitability. You have to worry about people listening, right? But you're not right. But that's why NPR works, right? Because it's not about clicks, right? I always say, I think we should fund public media more because public media is built around the notion of pursuing the truth. Whereas, understandably, private media, which should always exist, is built around profitability. And so that is the advantage I would lean into even more than you do. But you guys do a great job, so thank you.
Before thanking this panel and wrapping up the conference, I'll give you just one, and I can't believe I was just showing a radio guy how to use a microphone. Sorry. I'll give you one little optimistic thing about repositories of information and potential places in a community that can become repositories and to work with media going forward. An institution that we have almost everywhere in America, in every town, is a thing called a public library. Public library systems, and there have been some wonderful bits of research starting to look at partnerships and using the public library base as a repository of information and for good journalism. It's a brick and mortar place where you can go and sit and record your story if you don't have a newsroom any longer. And it has the resources. It's a place where people can gather. And so looking increasingly at our public library system as being one way for journalism to find a way forward at the local level. So there's a teeny look, read more about that because there's a lot of great stuff out there about that. And the NPR affiliates, if they're not tied into a university, would potentially fit into that environment really well as well. Well, it falls to me to first to thank this terrific last panel, which really was a perfect one to wrap up this incredibly exciting couple of days. Thanks you guys very much. Thanks to this panel. And as a Buckeye, I don't quite feel comfortable thanking you all on behalf of the University of Texas, but I will do my best to just thank everyone for taking the time, the organizers again, Michelle, you and Sally, and all the sponsors whose logos we've been seeing up here and heard over the course of the days. And I think we're kicking it exactly on time. It's 1:30. So wishing you good further conversations. You can follow up. Recordings of this will be available to everybody, and we look forward to following up, and I hope seeing you in a year's time. And I wish everyone safe travels. Thank you.